The puppy's whimpering was a thin, jagged sound that cut through the roar of the Atlantic like a knife through silk. "Please, little guy, just keep your head up," Norma Smith whispered to the wind, her fingers digging into the freezing wet sand. Salt spray stung her eyes, blurring the sight of the luxury yacht's tender as it rolled violently in the surf. Behind her, her father's voice was a desperate gale of its own. "Norma, get back. That water's a grave today." But Norma couldn't move, not backward anyway. Her gaze was locked on the gray abyss where a small brown and white head bobbed frantically. A few yards down the beach, the world of the powerful had frozen. Three men in charcoal Italian wool stood like statues against the storm, unmoved, untouched, and utterly useless. At their center stood Joseph Trevino. The Ice King looked exactly like the tabloids described, a man of fractured granite. For the first time in 30 years, the man who owned the city's docks, the man who decided who lived and died in this harbor, was powerless. He watched his only soft spot in the world drown, his jaw tight enough to crack bone. "You need to get him out of there," one of the guards barked, his eyes darting toward Trevino, then toward the churning, icy currents. "If he loses that dog, we all—" "I know," the other guard hissed, his heart hammered against his ribs. "But no one survives that tide. It's suicide." Norma didn't wait for the men in suits to find their courage. She had been working these docks since she was 6 years old. 11 years of hauling nets, 5 years of mending sails, and a lifetime of being invisible to men like Trevino. Then came the splash. It wasn't a professional rescuer or a Coast Guard diver. It was a girl, thin, drenched in a tattered cotton dress, and fueled by a desperation that matched the sea's fury. As Norma's arm reached out toward the terrified animal, the world held its breath. It was the life of a nobody for the heart of a monster. The fisherman's daughter dove straight into the jaws of the tide. "Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm responding to everyone. Click subscribe, like this video. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want me to miss them." Let's begin. Norma's knees scraped raw against the sand as she pressed 2 fingers against the small, soaked chest. Water poured from the animal's mouth in a pitiful stream, but the ribcage remained still. Behind her, the surf roared its triumph. It had won. It always won. But Norma refused to hear it. "Come on," she whispered, her voice hoarse from swallowed seawater. "Come on, little one." She tilted the puppy's head back, remembering the time her father had saved a pelican tangled in fishing line, half drowned and frantic. The same gentle pressure, the same desperate hope. She pressed again, rhythmic and careful, feeling for any flutter beneath her frozen fingertips. Nothing. From somewhere above her, a shadow fell. Norma didn't need to look up to know who it was. She could feel the weight of Joseph Trevino's presence, like a change in air pressure before a storm. The Ice King had moved from his frozen post, and now stood over her, close enough that she could see the Italian leather of his shoes darkening in the wet sand. "Is he?" Trevino's voice cracked. Actually cracked. The sound was so foreign, so human, that Norma's hands faltered for half a second. Then the puppy coughed. It was a small, wet, miserable sound, but it was life. The tiny chest heaved once, twice, and then a whimper broke free. Norma's breath came out in a sob of relief as she gathered the shivering animal against her chest, wrapping him in the torn hem of her dress. The puppy's dark eyes blinked open, confused and terrified, but breathing. "Breathing. He's alive," Norma said, and the words felt too small for the enormity of what had just happened. Trevino dropped to his knees. The guards behind him made sounds of shock, sharp intakes of breath that might have been comical in any other context. The Ice King didn't kneel. Not for mayors, not for senators, not for the bishops who came begging for donations. But here he was, expensive wool ruining itself in the sand, his hand reaching out with a tremor Norma had no business witnessing. "May I?" he asked, and the politeness in his voice was more frightening than any order would have been. Norma handed him the puppy carefully, watching as Trevino cradled the small body against his chest. The animal whimpered and burrowed into the fabric of a suit that probably cost more than her father's boat. For a long moment, the man said nothing. He just held the dog, his jaw working silently, his eyes fixed on the tiny heartbeat beneath his palm. When he finally looked up at Norma, his face had changed. Not softened. Joseph Trevino's face was carved from stone and would never be soft, but something had shifted behind his eyes. Something that looked almost like recognition. "You dove in," he said. It wasn't a question, but Norma nodded anyway. The current would have taken him in another 30 seconds. "My men wouldn't go in." Norma glanced at the 2 guards, who stood a careful distance away, their faces masks of professional neutrality. "They're smart," she said quietly. "That tide kills people every year. I grew up in it, but that doesn't mean it was a good idea." "Why did you do it?" The question hung in the salt air between them. Norma could have said a dozen things. That she loved animals, that she couldn't watch anything drown, that it was instinct. All of those would have been true. But when she looked at Joseph Trevino, at the way he held that puppy like it was the only fragile thing in his entire empire, she understood something else. Because nobody else would, she said simply. Trevino's throat worked. He stood slowly, the puppy still pressed against his chest, and for the first time in her 17 years, Norma saw a man who controlled everything realize he controlled nothing that mattered. He had money, power, fear, all the weapons the world offered, and none of them could have saved the one thing he actually loved. "What's your name?" he asked. "Norma Smith." He repeated it, testing the syllables like they were a prayer in a language he'd forgotten. "Norma Smith." Then, with the weight of a man making a blood oath, "I owe you a debt." One of the guards stepped forward. "Boss, we should get Biscuit to the vet." "I owe you a debt," Trevino said again, louder, his eyes never leaving Norma's face. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it. You saved my soul today, Miss Smith." His voice dropped to something raw, more honest than she suspected he'd been in years. "And I pay my debts." Before Norma could respond, he turned and walked toward the waiting car, the puppy, Biscuit, whimpering softly against his shoulder. The guards followed in tight formation, leaving Norma alone on the beach with her father running toward her, shouting her name in a voice cracked with relief and fury. But she wasn't looking at her father. She was staring at the retreating figure of Joseph Trevino, wondering what kind of debt a man like that would pay, and whether she'd just made the best mistake of her life. The envelope arrived 3 days later, delivered by a man in a black suit who looked like he'd never smiled in his life. Norma's father held it like it might explode. His hands, calloused from 30 years of working nets, trembled as he turned the heavy cream paper over, examining the wax seal pressed into blood-red wax. "A ship's anchor, Trevino's mark. Don't open it," her mother whispered from the doorway of their cramped kitchen. "Men like that don't send gifts. They send chains." But her father was already breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed on what looked like actual parchment, and a certified check that made Norma's knees go weak. She'd never seen that many zeros in her life. She'd never imagined that many zeros could exist on one piece of paper. "Dear Mr. Smith," her father read aloud, his voice hollow. "I am informed that you carry a debt of $63,000 to Harbor Trust and Loan, secured against your fishing vessel Mary Catherine, and your family home. Please consider this matter resolved. The enclosed check covers the full amount, plus interest accrued through next month. Your titles will be returned to you within 5 business days." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm Norma had weathered at sea. "There's more," her father said, his eyes scanning down the page. His face had gone the color of old snow. "He wants Norma." Her mother made a sound like she'd been struck. "Not like that," her father said quickly, though his hand shook harder. "He wants her to work at his estate. As his," he squinted at the paper, "as his personal attendant to matters of providence and fortune." "What the hell does that even mean?" Norma took the letter from his hands and read it herself. The language was formal, almost archaic, but the meaning was clear enough. Joseph Trevino wanted her to live at his estate, to be present at his significant undertakings, to serve as what the letter delicately called a consultant in affairs requiring exceptional moral clarity. At the bottom, in handwriting that looked like it had been carved rather than written, was a postscript. "You saved what I thought was already lost. I believe your presence brings fortune. I am not a man who ignores omens." "He thinks you're lucky," her mother said, and there was something close to hysteria in her voice. "He thinks you're some kind of charm he can keep in his pocket." "He paid off our debt," her father said quietly. "Norma, that loan, I was going to lose the boat next month. The house 2 months after that. We were." He stopped, his throat working. "We were finished." Norma looked around their kitchen. At the water stain on the ceiling, they couldn't afford to fix. At the crack in the window they'd patched with tape 3 winters ago. At her mother's hands, red and raw from taking in washing to make ends meet. At her father's eyes, which held the desperate, cornered look of a man who'd been drowning in debt as surely as that puppy had been drowning in the Atlantic. "What are the terms?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Her father found the second page. "Room and board at the estate. A salary of Jesus Christ. A salary of $5,000 a month. Sundays off. She can leave whenever she wants, but the debt forgiveness stands regardless." He looked up at Norma. It's not a trap. Legally, anyway." "Legally," her mother repeated bitterly. "What about actually? What happens when she wants to leave, and the Ice King decides his luck has run out?" But Norma was thinking about the way Trevino had held that puppy. The crack in his voice. The raw, honest grief of a man who'd thought he'd lost the only thing he loved. He was a monster. She had no illusions about that. The stories about Joseph Trevino could fill a library. and none of them ended well for the people who crossed him. But he paid his debts. "I'll go," she said. "Norma." "Dad." She took his hand, feeling the roughness of old rope burns against her palm. "You were going to lose everything. And he's offering me more money in a month than you make in a year. Maybe more than you make in 2 years." She swallowed hard. "I dove into the ocean for a puppy. I can survive a rich man's superstition." Her father pulled her into his arms, holding her tight enough that she could feel his heart hammering against her cheek. "If he hurts you," he whispered into her hair, "debt or no debt, I'll kill him myself." "I know," Norma said. And she did. But 3 days later, when the black car came to collect her, when she climbed into leather seats that smelled like money and fear, she wondered if her father would ever get the chance. The estate gates closed behind her with the finality of a prison door. The east wing of the Trevino estate had more bathrooms than Norma's entire neighborhood had houses. She stood in the doorway of what the housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Kovac, had called her quarters, trying to reconcile the word quarters with the sprawling suite before her. The bedroom alone was larger than the entire first floor of her family's home. The bathroom had heated marble floors. Heated, as if regular floors weren't sufficient for the act of standing. "Mr. Trevino expects you for dinner at 7, Mrs. Kovac said, her accent thick and Eastern European, her expression suggesting that she'd seen 1,000 girls like Norma come and go. "Dress is in the closet. Don't be late." The door closed with a soft click that somehow felt like a verdict. Norma moved through the room like she was walking through a museum. Everything was cream and gold and untouchable. The bed had more pillows than any reasonable person could need. The window overlooked gardens so precisely manicured they looked artificial, like someone had taken the concept of nature and filed down all its interesting parts. The closet held a dozen dresses, all in her size, all in shades that probably had names like Whisper and Dawn. She chose the simplest one, a dove gray that didn't shimmer or cling, and tried not to think about how someone had known her measurements without ever asking. At 7 o'clock exactly, a different servant, this one young and male and carefully blank-faced, came to escort her to dinner. They walked through hallways lined with art that Norma suspected was worth more than her father's boat, past rooms that seemed to serve no purpose except to exist expensively. The entire house felt like a mausoleum. Beautiful, cold, and built for the dead. The dining room could have seated 30 people. Tonight it seated 2. Trevino sat at the head of a table long enough to host a small nation, biscuit curled in his lap. The puppy's tail wagged when he saw Norma, the only movement in the entire frozen tableau. Trevino himself looked carved from the same marble as his floors, pressed suit, perfect posture, and eyes that tracked her approach like a hawk watching prey. "Miss Smith," he said, and gestured to the chair approximately 7 miles away at the other end of the table. "Please sit." Norma sat. A servant materialized to pour wine into a glass she had no intention of touching. Another placed a plate before her that held food arranged like architecture. Beautiful, precise, and faintly hostile. "I trust your accommodations are satisfactory," Trevino said. It wasn't a question. "They're very generous, Mr. Trevino." "Joseph." He cut into something on his plate, with surgical precision. "If you're to live here, we should dispense with formality. Then you should call me Norma." Something that might have been amusement flickered behind his eyes. "I already do, Miss Smith." They ate in silence, broken only by the soft clink of silverware against china. Norma watched Trevino feed Biscuit small pieces of chicken from his own plate, his fingers gentle as he stroked the puppy's ears. The tenderness of the gesture was so at odds with everything else about the man that it felt obscene, like witnessing something private she had no right to see. "Why am I really here?" she asked finally, setting down her fork. Trevino looked up. In the candlelight, his face was all shadows and angles. "I told you. You're my good luck charm. I'm a person, not a rabbit's foot." "I'm aware." He took a slow sip of wine. "Do you know what I do, Miss Smith?" "Everyone knows what you do." "Then you know I operate in a world where success is measured in margins so thin they could cut you. One bad decision, one moment of poor judgment, and empires fall." He set down his glass with deliberate care. 3 days ago, I watched my men, trained professionals who I pay extraordinary sums to protect what's mine, stand frozen while the only thing I love drowned. And then you, a girl I'd never met, dove into water that should have killed you. That doesn't make me lucky. That makes me stupid. Perhaps. Biscuit yawned in his lap, tiny teeth flashing white. Or perhaps you're the kind of person who acts when others freeze, who sees what needs to be done, and simply does it. He leaned forward slightly. That is extraordinarily rare in my world, Miss Smith. Some might even call it miraculous. And what happens when your luck runs out? When I can't fix whatever breaks next? For the first time since she'd entered the room, Trevino smiled. It was not a comforting expression, Then I suppose we'll both discover what happens when the Ice King stops believing in miracles. That night, lying in a bed too soft and too large, Norma stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence of the manor. No creaking boards, no sound of the ocean, no warmth of her sister breathing in the next bed. Just endless expensive quiet. Somewhere in this vast, cold house, a puppy slept in the arms of a monster. It was, she realized, the only honest thing in the entire estate. The library was Trevino's natural habitat. Norma found him there most mornings, surrounded by ledgers and contracts, a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow while Biscuit dozed on an obscenely expensive rug. This morning he'd summoned her with a curt note slipped under her door. Library. 8 o'clock. Ring your judgment. She arrived to find 3 men waiting. They sat in leather chairs, arranged in a half circle, each one dressed in suits that screamed money but whispered desperation. Trevino stood by the window, backlit by morning sun, looking like a king about to pass sentence. Miss Smith, he said without turning, these gentlemen have come to pitch me investment opportunities. I'd like you to tell me which one is lying. The men shifted uncomfortably. One of them, silver-haired, with a smile too wide to be genuine, laughed. Is this a joke? I don't make jokes about money, Mr. Patterson. Trevino finally turned, his expression flat. Miss Smith is my consultant in matters of fortune. Gentlemen, please proceed with your presentations. She'll be listening. The first man pitched a real estate development in the Harbor District. His voice was smooth, practiced, full of projected revenue and market analysis. He never looked at Norma once. The second man presented a tech startup, stumbling over his words, sweating through his collar despite the room's careful climate control. He kept glancing at her like she might save him. The third man, Patterson, spoke about offshore shipping routes with the confidence of someone who'd given this speech 100 times. His numbers were perfect. His projections gleamed. Everything about him was polished to a mirror shine. When they finished, Trevino looked at Norma. Well, she felt the weight of 6 sets of eyes. The 3 men watched her with expressions ranging from amusement to contempt to desperate hope. Trevino's face revealed nothing. The first man believes what he's saying, but his numbers are optimistic, Norma said quietly. The second man is terrified, but he's honest. He knows his company might fail, but he thinks it's worth trying anyway. And Patterson? Trevino asked. Norma looked at the silver-haired man directly. He's lying about something. I don't know what, but he's too comfortable. Too perfect. People telling the truth usually have doubts. Patterson's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. This is absurd. Joseph, you're going to make business decisions based on the intuition of a what, Mr. Patterson? Trevino's voice could have frozen the harbor. Please, finish your thought. The room held its breath. A consultant, Patterson amended smoothly. Someone with no background in finance or shipping, or... The harbor route you described doesn't exist, Norma interrupted. Or it does, but not the way you said. My father's a fisherman. I know those waters. The coordinates you mentioned would put your ships directly through the reef system off Baker's Point. No one runs cargo through there unless they're running something they don't want inspected. The silence that followed was absolute. Patterson stood abruptly. I don't have to listen to this. No, Trevino agreed. You don't. Marcus will show you out. A man materialized from the shadows, one of the ever-present guards, and Patterson left with as much dignity as a man could muster while being escorted out by muscle. The other 2 men received their answers within the hour. The real estate developer got a polite rejection. The tech founder got a check and a handshake that looked like it might break him with relief. When they were alone again, Trevino poured 2 glasses of something amber and offered one to Norma. How did you know? About Patterson? She took the glass but didn't drink. My father always said that honest men hesitate before they ask for money. They know what they're risking, yours and theirs. Liars don't hesitate because they're not risking anything real. Your father is a wise man. Trevino settled into his chair, Biscuit immediately jumping into his lap. In my world, every interaction is mediated by contracts, lawyers, leverage. I haven't trusted someone at their word in 15 years. That sounds exhausting. It's survival. He studied her over the rim of his glass. You trust people. Some people. How do you know which ones? Norma thought about her father's calloused hands, her mother's fierce protection, the neighbor who'd brought them soup when her sister was sick, even though they could barely afford it themselves. You can't always know. Sometimes you just have to decide that trusting someone is worth the risk of being wrong. That's a luxury I can't afford. Is it? She looked at Biscuit, content and dozing. You trusted me to save him. You didn't have a contract for that. Something shifted in Trevino's expression. Not softening exactly, but settling, like a building finding its foundation after an earthquake. No, he said quietly. I suppose I didn't. He stood and walked to his desk, returning with a folder. These are contracts for 3 more deals I'm considering. I'd like your opinion before I sign. I'm not a businesswoman. No. He set the folder in her hands. You're someone who knows the difference between a man who's desperate and a man who's dangerous. In my world, Miss Smith, that's infinitely more valuable. That night, Norma read contracts by lamplight until her eyes burned, and wondered when exactly she'd stopped being a hostage and started being a partner. Norma had been living in the manor for 3 weeks when she started walking at night. Sleep didn't come easily in rooms that large, that quiet. Back home, she'd fallen asleep to the sound of the ocean and her sister's breathing, to the familiar creaks of old wood settling. Here, silence pressed against her ears until she had to move, had to do something other than lie in expensive sheets and feel like an imposter. The gardens were beautiful under moonlight, all silver and shadow, but they felt as artificial as everything else in Trevino's world. So she walked farther, past the manicured lawns, toward the service entrance where the real work of the estate happened, where deliveries arrived, and staff smoked cigarettes and talked in voices that weren't carefully modulated for the master's ears. That's where she saw Carlo Massetti. She recognized him from dinners, Trevino's underboss, a man who sat at the right hand and laughed at appropriate moments, and watched everything with eyes like calculation machines. He was supposed to be in Boston on business. Trevino had mentioned it that morning, feeding biscuit pieces of bacon while reviewing shipping manifests. But here was Massetti, very much not in Boston, standing by the east gate with 2 men Norma had never seen before. She faded into the shadows of the garden wall, her fisherman's instincts screaming at her to be still, be quiet, be invisible. Can't keep stalling, one of the strangers was saying. His accent was thick, Eastern European. Varga wants an answer by Friday, or the offer disappears. I need more time. Massetti's voice was tight. Trevino's been distracted lately, but he's not stupid. If I move too fast, then don't move. Step aside. The second stranger lit a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating hard features and harder eyes. We'll handle Trevino ourselves. Varga just needs to know you won't get in the way. And after? Massetti asked. After Trevino's gone? After you run the harbor operations for Varga. Same territory, better percentage, and you don't have to play second fiddle to a man who trusts his luck to some dock rat he pulled off the beach. The words hit Norma like a physical blow. She pressed her hand against the cold stone wall to steady herself. The girl's irrelevant, Massetti said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Trevino will get bored of his superstitions soon enough. Will he? The first stranger stepped closer. We've been watching, Massetti. He's had her sit in on 3 major deals. Word is she spotted the Patterson fraud before Trevino's own accountants did. She's not decoration anymore. She's a liability. What are you saying? I'm saying Varga wants to know if she's included in the neutralization plan, or if you need us to handle that separately. The world tilted. Norma's breath came too fast, too loud in her own ears. These men were talking about killing Trevino. About killing her. As casually as discussing shipping schedules. I'll handle the girl if it comes to that, Massetti said finally. She's nobody. No family that matters. No protection. She disappears, and who's going to ask questions? Good. The cigarette arced through the air, landing in a shower of sparks. Friday, Massetti. Varga's patience has limits. They separated. The strangers disappearing through the gate in a black sedan, Massetti heading back toward the main house through a side entrance. Norma stayed frozen against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She should go to Trevino, right now. Wake him up and tell him everything. But what if he didn't believe her? What if he thought she was trying to manipulate him, playing on his superstitions to eliminate a rival? Massetti had been with him for 15 years. She'd been here for 3 weeks. A girl who'd pulled a puppy from the ocean, versus a man who'd helped build an empire. Norma closed her eyes and thought about her father teaching her to read the water. The current doesn't care what you believe, he told her once. It is what it is. Your job is to see it clearly and act accordingly. She saw this clearly. Massetti was going to betray Trevino. The Varga syndicate was moving against him, and she had until Friday to figure out how to prove it. The walk back to her room felt longer than the swim to save Biscuit. When she finally closed the door behind her, she found a note that had been slipped under it while she was gone. Trevino's handwriting, sharp and precise. Breakfast meeting, 7 o'clock. Massetti will be joining us. He's returned early from Boston. Norma looked at the note for a long time. Then she went to her closet and found the plainest dress she owned, something that wouldn't draw attention, wouldn't make her look like she knew anything at all. She had 8 hours to figure out how to save a monster's life. Again. The gala was supposed to be neutral ground. Norma had spent the afternoon being transformed by a team of women who treated her like a particularly challenging art project. Hair twisted into something elegant and precarious. Makeup applied with the precision of war paint. A dress the color of midnight that cost more than her father's boat and felt like wearing liquid starlight. "You'll stay close to me tonight," Trevino had told her that morning. Biscuit nestled in his arms as always. "The Maritime Commission votes on harbor contracts next week. Everyone who matters will be there, which means everyone who wants to kill me will also be there." He'd said it like he was discussing the weather. Now, standing in the ballroom of the Grandmont Hotel, Norma understood what neutral ground meant in Trevino's world. It meant that the people smiling at each other over champagne had probably ordered hits on each other's operations. It meant that the orchestra played Vivaldi, while fortunes and lives were negotiated in hushed corners. It meant that violence was always present, just wearing better clothes. Massetti worked the room like a politician, shaking hands and laughing at jokes, playing the loyal underboss perfectly. Norma watched him the way her father had taught her to watch storm clouds, looking for the small signs that predicted devastation. She saw it at 9:30. Massetti checked his watch, made eye contact with a man by the north entrance, nodded once. "We need to leave," Norma said quietly, her hand finding Trevino's arm. "Right now." Trevino didn't question her. That was the thing she'd learned about him over the past 3 weeks. He'd hired her for her instincts, and he actually trusted them. "Marcus," he said to the guard at his shoulder. "Back exit." They were halfway across the ballroom when the lights went out. The darkness lasted maybe 3 seconds. Just long enough for the screaming to start, for bodies to surge in panic, for Norma to hear the distinctive sound of silenced gunfire cutting through the chaos. She felt Trevino's hand lock around her wrist, pulling her down as something shattered above their heads. Emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in sickly red. Through the crowd, Norma saw Massetti standing perfectly still, untouched by the panic around him, watching the spot where Trevino had been standing with an expression of cold calculation. "The main exits are blocked," Marcus shouted over the chaos. "They've got the stairwells covered. Then we go through them," Trevino said, his voice deadly calm even as another burst of gunfire sent the crowd surging. "Boss, there's at least 6 shooters." "The vents," Norma interrupted. Both men looked at her like she'd spoken another language. "The building's ventilation system. Hotels like this, they run the big industrial vents through the service corridors. My uncle worked HVAC. Buildings like this, they always connect to the kitchen exhaust on the ground floor." Trevino's eyes narrowed. "Can you find them?" "I can try." "That's good enough." "Marcus, on her." They moved through the chaos like fish through current, using the panicked crowd as cover. Norma led them away from the grand spaces where people in expensive clothes trampled each other, toward the narrow corridors where the real work of the hotel happened. Staff were evacuating, their uniforms creating streams of movement that Norma followed on instinct. She found the maintenance access behind a door marked, "Authorized personnel only." Inside, the walls were exposed brick and pipes, the elegant facade stripped away to reveal the building's bones. And there, running along the ceiling like metal arteries, the ventilation ducts. "You cannot be serious," Marcus said, staring up at the vent cover. "You have a better idea?" Norma was already dragging a supply shelf beneath the vent. "Because those men are coming through that door in about 30 seconds. Trevino climbed onto the shelf with the grace of a man who'd scaled worse obstacles. He pulled the vent cover free with his bare hands, muscles straining against expensive fabric. "Miss Smith, you first." "I can't. You know where we're going." "We don't." "Move." Norma climbed. The vent was tight, claustrophobic, the metal cold against her bare arms. Behind her, she heard Trevino pulling himself up. Then Marcus, then the vent cover being forced back into place, just as voices echoed in the corridor below. "Check everywhere. If Trevino's still in this building, I want him found." Massetti's voice. Close enough that Norma could picture his face through the thin metal beneath her. She crawled forward, her expensive dress catching and tearing on rivets, her carefully styled hair coming undone. The vent system was a maze of turns and junctions, but she followed the flow of air, the slight pull that meant exhaust, that meant outside, that meant escape. Behind her, Trevino crawled in silence, his breathing controlled despite the impossible angles and cramped space. This man, who controlled empires, reduced to crawling through air ducts, because a fisherman's daughter had remembered an uncle's stories about building layouts. They emerged in the kitchen exhaust vent 20 minutes later, dropping into an alley that smelled like garbage and grease and freedom. Trevino's suit was ruined. Marcus had lost his weapon somewhere in the vents. Norma's dress looked like it had been attacked by wild animals. Trevino looked at her, then started to laugh. It was a sound she'd never heard from him, genuine, almost unhinged with relief and adrenaline. "Miss Smith," he said, still laughing as sirens wailed in the distance. "You are either the best luck I've ever had, or you're going to be the death of me." "Tonight, we'll settle for alive," Norma said, and led them into the shadows of the alley, away from the chaos, away from Massetti's betrayal, away from everything except survival. They regrouped at a safe house on the industrial edge of the city, a place that smelled like rust and old violence. Trevino sat at a metal table in what might charitably be called a kitchen, his ruined suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. Before him lay a collection of phones, weapons, and a handwritten list of names that grew longer with each passing minute. Marcus stood guard at the door while two other men Norma didn't recognize worked phones in the corner, their voices low and lethal. Massetti's entire crew, Trevino said, adding another name to the list. His handwriting was precise even now. Each letter, a small act of controlled fury. Everyone who reports to him directly. We can't know how deep the rot goes, so we cut out everything that might be infected. That's 17 people, Norma said quietly from where she stood by the window, still in her destroyed dress, still tasting copper fear in the back of her throat. 18, Massetti's driver knew. Had to. Another name joined the list. They'll be dead by sunrise. The Varga contact points will be hit simultaneously. Send a message that can't be misunderstood. Joseph. Don't. He didn't look up from his list. You don't get to tell me how to handle betrayal. Not after tonight. Not after they tried to kill you too. Norma moved closer to the table, her bare feet silent on the concrete floor. Someone had given her a blanket that she'd wrapped around her shoulders, but she still felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. I'm not telling you to forgive them. Good. Because I don't forgive. He set down his pen with careful precision. I eliminate threats, permanently. It's how I've survived 30 years in a business where most men don't make it past 5. And how many bodies have you left behind in those 30 years? The question hung in the stale air between them. Trevino finally looked at her, his eyes holding something too complex to name. Does the number matter? Yes, Norma said simply. Because everybody you leave behind creates someone else who wants you dead. A brother, a son, a friend who decides revenge is worth dying for. She sat down across from him, the metal chair cold through her dress. You kill 18 people tonight, and you create 18 reasons for the next betrayal. So what would you have me do, Miss Smith? Forgive Massetti? Give him a stern talking to? He tried to murder me. Murder you? Should I just let that slide and hope his conscience keeps him honest next time? No. Norma reached across the table and turned his list around to face her. The name stared back. 18 lives reduced to ink on paper. You make him irrelevant instead of making him a martyr. Trevino leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. I'm listening. Massetti betrayed you because he thought he'd be more powerful working for Varga. Because he was tired of being second. She traced a finger down the list, stopping at names she recognized from her weeks at the manor. But what if instead of killing him you destroy his credibility? Make it so that no one in this world would ever trust him again? How? Norma thought about her father negotiating fish prices, the way he'd learned to navigate the politics of the docks without ever throwing a punch. You have proof of his betrayal now. Records of his meetings with Varga's people. Probably financial transactions if you look hard enough. So you don't kill him, you expose him, publicly. Let everyone in your world see exactly what he tried to do and how badly he failed. Marcus spoke from his position by the door. Boss, with respect, that's weak. In our business, betrayal gets one answer. In your business, yes, Norma said. But what about everyone else? The politicians you work with. The legitimate businessmen who look the other way. They can stomach violence when it's hidden, but public executions? That makes people nervous. That makes them wonder if they're next. She has a point, one of the men on the phone said grudgingly. The Maritime Commission is already spooked after tonight. We start leaving bodies all over the city, they might decide we're more trouble than we're worth. Trevino was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that might have been a funeral march. You're asking me to show mercy. I'm asking you to be smart, Norma corrected. Mercy is for priests. This is strategy. You expose Massetti, you freeze his assets. You make sure every organization from here to Moscow knows he's a failed traitor. He becomes a cautionary tale instead of a martyr. And everyone who might have thought about betraying you sees what happens when you fail. You don't get the honor of a quick death. You get to live with everyone knowing you're worthless. That's crueler than killing him, Marcus observed. Yes, Norma agreed. It is. But it doesn't create 17 other families looking for revenge. Trevino picked up his list and stared at it for what felt like hours. Then, with deliberate care, he drew a single line through all the names except one. Carlo Massetti. He'll run, Marcus warned. Let him. Trevino's smile was a predator's expression, all teeth and promise. I want him to run. I want him to spend the rest of his miserable life looking over his shoulder, knowing that I'm still here, still powerful, and that I showed him exactly how little he mattered by not even bothering to kill him. He stood and walked to where Norma sat, placing one hand on her shoulder. His grip was firm but not cruel, and when he spoke, his voice carried something that might have been respect. You saved my life twice now, Miss Smith. Once from drowning. Once from becoming the kind of monster who can't stop killing long enough to think. He squeezed her shoulder once, then released her. I hope you understand what that means. You're not my good luck charm anymore. You're my conscience. And that's infinitely more dangerous. I know, Norma said, and she did. Outside, dawn was breaking over the city, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. The pier where it all ended was the same one where Norma had spent half her childhood. She knew every rotted board, every place where the wood groaned under weight, every shadow where the dockworkers used to hide from her father's foreman. It smelled like brine and diesel and the particular funk of fish guts that never quite washed away, no matter how many storms came through. Massetti had chosen it for the meeting. Neutral ground, he'd said in the message that had arrived at dawn. Just him and Trevino. A chance to explain. A chance to make things right. It's a trap, Marcus had said immediately, and he wasn't wrong. But Trevino had looked at Norma across the breakfast table. Take out coffee and bagels in the safe house. Biscuit dozing in a cardboard box because they hadn't dared return to the manor, and asked, "What do you think?" "I think he's desperate," Norma had said. "And desperate men make mistakes." So here they were at midnight, standing on a pier that had seen 1,000 deals go bad, while the Atlantic churned black and hungry beneath their feet. Trevino had brought Marcus and 4 other men, positioned at careful intervals. Massetti stood at the far end of the pier with 3 of his own people, silhouettes against the distant lights of the harbor. Norma stood at Trevino's shoulder, wrapped in a borrowed coat that smelled like gun oil and cigarettes, and watched the 2 men who'd built an empire together prepare to tear it apart. "Joseph," Massetti called across the distance. His voice carried false warmth, the kind of friendly tone that made Norma's skin crawl. "I'm glad you came. We can still fix this." "Fix it." Trevino's voice was flat, emotionless. He'd put his mask back on, the Ice King, unmoved and unmovable. "You tried to have me killed, Carlo. You sold me out to Varga. Explain to me what part of that we're fixing. It wasn't supposed to go that way." Massetti took a step forward. His men tensed, hands moving toward concealed weapons. Marcus's crew mirrored the movement. "Varga was just supposed to buy out your harbor operations. A clean business deal. The hit at the gala, that wasn't my call. They moved without consulting me." "Liar," Norma said quietly, but in the silence of the pier her voice carried. Massetti's eyes found her for the first time. "The dock rat speaks. Tell me, girl, how long do you think you'll last once you're not useful anymore? Once Joseph's superstitions wear off and he remembers what you really are? Careful, Carlo." Trevino's hand moved to his waistband, where Norma knew he kept a gun. She'd seen him check it 3 times before they left the safe house. "You don't get to talk to her." "Why? Because she's special?" Massetti laughed, and it was an ugly sound. "She's a novelty. A pet. Just like that stupid dog. You've gone soft, Joseph. The man I knew 15 years ago would have put a bullet in me the moment he suspected betrayal. But now you have your lucky charm, and your conscience, and you think that makes you stronger. It makes you weak." Trevino's hand closed around the gun. Norma saw it happening in slow motion. The way his shoulders set, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes went dead and cold. This was the man who'd survived 3 decades in a business built on blood. This was the man who'd built an empire on the principle that betrayal only ended one way. This was the man she'd convinced to show mercy, and mercy was about to die on this pier. "Joseph," she said, and put her hand over his before he could draw the weapon. "Don't. He tried to kill us. I know. He deserves to die." "Maybe." Norma kept her hand on his, feeling the tension in his fingers, the way his whole body was coiled like a spring. "But you told me you were going to make him irrelevant. You told me you were going to be smart about this. Smart doesn't feel like enough right now. I know that too." She squeezed his hand. "But you kill him here. You prove him right. You prove that I haven't changed anything. That you're still just the Ice King, and violence is the only language you speak." Behind them, Marcus shifted nervously. Ahead, Massetti watched with growing confidence, sensing weakness in Trevino's hesitation. "You want to know what my father taught me about the ocean?" Norma said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "He said the tide always wins. Not because it's violent, but because it's patient. It doesn't fight the rocks. It just keeps coming back until the rocks wear down to nothing." Trevino's hand relaxed fractionally under hers. "Be the tide," she whispered, "not the storm." For a long moment, nothing moved except the waves beneath the pier. Then Trevino lowered his hand, releasing the gun. "You're done, Carlo," he said, his voice carrying across the pier with absolute finality. "Your accounts are frozen. Your contacts have been informed that you're persona non grata. Varga received evidence of your incompetence this afternoon. Apparently they don't like working with people who can't even manage a simple assassination. You're not worth killing. You're not worth the bullet. Massetti's face transformed from confidence to rage, to something close to despair. Joseph, leave. Tonight, if I see you in this city again, mercy becomes memory. Trevino turned his back, the ultimate insult, and began walking toward the shore. Come on, Miss Smith, we're done here. Norma followed, her heart hammering, half expecting to hear gunfire. But there was only the sound of waves and footsteps and, behind them, Massetti's raw shout of impotent fury. They were halfway back to the car, when Trevino stopped and looked at her. He was right, you know. The old me would have killed him without hesitation. I know. Are you trying to save my soul, Miss Smith? Norma thought about that puppy in the water. About the way Trevino held him like he was the only real thing in a world of shadows and lies. No, she said honestly. I'm trying to save the part of you that's still capable of holding something gently. Something shifted in his expression. Not soft, never soft, but human. Complicated, real. Then I suppose, he said quietly, we're both succeeding. 6 months changed everything and nothing. The manor still felt too large, too quiet, but Norma had learned which rooms caught the morning light and which corners biscuit, now considerably less biscuit and more full loaf, preferred for his afternoon naps. The puppy had grown into something gangly and enthusiastic, all paws and tongue and boundless affection for the two humans who'd saved his life. The harbor had settled into an uneasy peace. Massetti had disappeared somewhere south. Miami, the rumors said, working collections for a loan shark who didn't know his history. The Varga syndicate had withdrawn their operations after Trevino had quietly acquired leverage on 3 of their key politicians. No blood, no bodies. Just information deployed with surgical precision. You're getting good at this, Marcus had told her last month, after she'd helped negotiate a profit-sharing agreement with the Longshoremen's Union that had prevented a strike. Too good. Boss is going to have trouble letting you go. But Norma wasn't sure she wanted to go anymore. Now she walked the beach at dawn, Trevino beside her in jeans, and a sweater that made him look almost normal, almost human. Biscuit bounded ahead, chasing seagulls with the eternal optimism of a creature who'd never actually caught one, and never would. Your father's boat came in this morning, Trevino said, his hands in his pockets, his gaze on the horizon. Good haul. The new equipment is working well. You didn't have to buy him new nets. I didn't buy them for him. I bought them for you. He glanced at her sideways. You worry about him. I eliminated something you worry about. Seemed efficient. Norma smiled, despite herself. 6 months, and he still couldn't just admit he'd done something kind. Thank you, Joseph. You're welcome, Norma. They walked in comfortable silence, the kind that only came from surviving things together. From late nights reviewing contracts. From teaching him that not every problem required leverage or threats. From him teaching her that sometimes the world actually was as brutal as it seemed, and kindness required its own kind of strength. The Maritime Commission approved the expansion permits, he said after a while. We break ground on the new facility in April. Congratulations. It was your idea. The environmental protections, the community investment, all that soft power nonsense I thought was weakness. He bent to pick up a piece of driftwood, examining it before tossing it for Biscuit to chase. Turns out it's just a different kind of leverage. Harder to quantify, but effective. It's not leverage if it's genuine, isn't it? He looked at her with those eyes that still sometimes saw too much. You make me better, Miss Smith. That's a form of power. I don't want power over you. I know. That's why it works. Biscuit returned with the driftwood, dropping it at Trevino's feet with a proud wag of his entire back end. Trevino scratched behind the dog's ears with the unself-conscious affection he only showed when he thought no one important was watching. Norma had learned she didn't count as important in that calculation. She was something else, something closer. I got a letter yesterday, she said, watching the waves. From a college, their business program. Someone sent them my work on the union negotiations. Trevino went very still. Did they? Full scholarship, room and board included. She turned to face him. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? I may have made some calls. He threw the driftwood again, not meeting her eyes. You're wasted as a superstition, Norma. You should be running things. Building things. The scholarship just opens doors you should have access to. And after college, do I come back here? That depends. He finally looked at her, and his expression was carefully neutral in a way that meant it mattered. Do you want to? Norma thought about the girl who dove into the ocean 6 months ago, who'd been so sure she was saving a puppy, nothing more. Who'd had no idea that one moment of reckless compassion would lead her here, to a beach at dawn with a monster who was learning to be a man, to a future that stretched farther than she'd ever imagined possible. Ask me again in 4 years, she said. Something that might have been relief flickered across his face. I can wait 4 years. Can you? The Ice King, patient. For some things. He started walking again, Biscuit bounding between them. Besides, I'll need someone to run the charitable foundation I'm establishing. Turns out communities need investment. Healthcare. Education. Someone should handle that. Let me guess. Someone with experience in both business and communities. If you know anyone qualified. His tone was innocent in a way that wasn't innocent at all. Norma laughed, the sound carrying across the water. You're impossible. I'm practical. There's a difference. He paused at the water's edge, where waves licked at the sand. You saved my life, Norma. Multiple times. In multiple ways. The least I can do is make sure you have a life worth living in return. Is that what this is? Paying your debt? No. He said it quietly, but with certainty. The debt was paid the moment you convinced me not to kill Massetti. This is something else. What? Trevino was quiet for a long moment, watching Biscuit chase foam up the beach. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of admissions he'd probably never made before. Friendship maybe, partnership, a reminder that even ice can melt if you're patient enough. The sun was fully up now, painting the harbor in shades of gold and possibility. Somewhere behind them, the city was waking up. Trevino's city, built on foundations of fear and respect and careful violence. But here, on this beach, with a dog who'd been saved and a man who was learning how to be saved, it felt like something new was being built. Something that didn't require contracts or leverage or blood. Just a fisherman's daughter, and a monster who'd learned that mercy wasn't weakness. And a puppy who'd brought them together, now barking at the waves like he owned the entire ocean. Come on, Norma said, starting back toward the manor. Mrs. Kovac will have breakfast ready, and you know how she gets when we're late. Terrifying woman, Trevino agreed, falling into step beside her. Remind me why I hired her. Because she's the only person in your organization who isn't afraid of you. Besides you. Besides me, Norma agreed. They walked back together, leaving footprints in the sand that the tide would erase by afternoon. Behind them, the harbor stretched vast and peaceful, holding its secrets beneath calm water. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something unexpected had survived. Thanks for watching. Please like, comments, and subscribe.